Hey guys, Justin here with JHart Modelworks. I'm finally over the sinus infection crud, so I can do the voiceover and the editing for the first part of the build series on our Tamiya Gordon Muray T.50. We're going to go ahead and we are going to focus on the body paint in this episode. The body doesn't show up until like deep into the second half of the instruction novel, but this paint job was kind of stressing me out and psyching me out, and I really needed to get this taken care of first, so that's where we're going to start, and then we will jump back and start working on everything else. Before we get started on this video, I do want to come clean and be honest about the video itself. What you're going to see is my first round of painting the parts for the body. A couple of these parts had to be repainted. I was able to get them all painted, and I was able to get the candy perfectly smooth across all the parts, and then due to some mistakes made on my end, such as moving the parts and not paying attention, some of the parts spun around on the little sticks and ran into each other. So I had to try and sand and polish, and I was able to save one of them. I burned through a couple other parts and ended up having to strip them and repaint them. The front valance for this car I have repainted like 3 times, but I have everything painted up, everything's color matched, and it all looks really good. But like I said, this is just going to be the first round of painting it. Repainting everything is done exactly the same way, and it's not that I messed something up during the paint job process, it's literally just the fact that I messed it up while I was waiting for the clear to dry. So don't think y'all want to sit and rewatch me paint over and over and over again. I didn't really want to paint over and over and over again, so we're just going to stick with going through it the first time. But I did want to be upfront and honest about the fact that, you know, things happen. Mistakes get made, and, you know, tragedy strikes all of us. And it's really about how you go about addressing those mistakes and, you know, fixing the model. Another thing I've noticed is that Paul from ISM has announced that he's doing this model for his birthday build, which is cool. It's a great kit, and he's doing it in orange, which I found kind of funny. He's using a pearl orange. It's a Nissan color, I believe. I think it's like a GTR color or something like that. He's using a pearl, which will be an easier paint job, to be honest. It's the smarter way to go because you don't have to worry about trying to color balance candy across all those parts. So like I said, it is definitely a smarter way to go on this kit to do it in a pearl than in a candy. It will be kind of cool to see the differences in, you know, how the bodies come out. With a candy paint, what I typically see is that you get more range of color. The highlights are a lot brighter, the shadows are a lot deeper with a candy paint than with a pearl. But again, it's a lot more work doing candy paint. So I have rambled for a bit. Let's go ahead and get this flipped around and get started on the building. So before we start painting, we of course need to get all the prep out of the way, but there's actually very little prep to do. We need to cut the body parts off the sprue with our nippers, and then we're going to clean the sprue gate marks up with some sanders. I'm using some 400 grit sandpaper on the Display aluminum sanding stick here. It does a really good job of cleaning these up. Once we have all the sprue marks cleaned up, we then need to move on to keying the body with some 3000 grit Tamiya sanding sponge. Every body panel is a separate part, so there's no panel lines to rescribe, and there are no mold seams on the body either. There are some sharp ridges that run back along the front cowling right from the top of the headlight openings. I almost sanded these smooth. Do not do it. These creases are not mold seams, they are actual body lines in the design of the car. There's a matching set of creases that run along each of the back engine bay cover pieces as well, so leave those intact too. For keying the body, when I use candy paints, I don't like to use a 600 or 1000 grit like some people do when they key. I've found that using these grits, sometimes you will end up with scratches that don't get filled up by your primer. I've sprayed 3 coats of primer and 3 coats of silver base on one build. Everything looked perfect. And as soon as that first coat of candy went down, bam, dark straight scratch marks where I had sanded on the body, and there was nothing I could do but just strip and respray it. So now I stay with about 3000, as the Mr. Surfacer 1500 will easily fill those scratches. Now the last thing we need to do before we get ready to just start priming these parts is to wipe all the parts down with some UMP airbrush cleaner, or you can use, isopropyl alcohol. What we want to do is we want to get the parts nice and clean and get any oils from our hands and sanding contamination from the sandpaper. Just get everything off of there so we have a nice clean surface for that primer to grip to. Alright, it is time to spray some primer. We're going to be spraying Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black. I know I use this all the time. I really like this primer, especially the black version of it, especially when I'm putting down a silver base. It is a fantastic primer. I don't use the rattle can version. I buy the 40 milliliter pots. I get them from King's Hobby, or I get them from Burbank's House of Hobbies. I like to thin them about 50-50 with Mr. Leveling Thinner, and this gives me a primer that lays down perfect every single time. If I accidentally spray it too heavy, it'll just level itself out and take care of me. If I spray it a little thin, it'll level itself out and take care of me. We're not trying for super thin coats, but we're not really trying to flood it either. Just a nice, smooth, even coat across all these parts. Once again, we're going to do 3 coats of this primer. So there are 13 individual body panels to spray. I'm not going to go over every single panel, but I will show you a few panels for each coat. I'm also not going to show every single coat of doing the primer. You see the first one go down. After that, it's just spraying black on top of black, and you can't really see much in the footage. You can barely tell that anything's really going down. So I figure we'll just do this first coat of primer. No, I did 3, and I waited about 10 minutes between each coat. And then I gave it at least an hour to gas off before I moved on to the silver base. Speaking of that silver base, you'll notice that the parts are already silver. This is the second coat. I don't know what happened to the footage for the first coat. When I went to load it in, it was the footage for the second coat. It was the exact same video file as coat 2. I'm not sure how that happened. So we are going to spray 2 light coats of Zero Paints Extra Fine Candy Base. I absolutely love this base. It is a beautiful, bright silver. I also absolutely hate this candy base. Zero Paints are ridiculously hot, meaning that it's got a very aggressive thinner in it. And if you spray it heavy, it will start to eat all the layers that are underneath it and go straight down and start to craze the plastic, which is basically where it causes wrinkles. Once that happens, the only thing you can do is strip all the paint off, sand the plastic to get it back to perfectly smooth, and start over again. I also have seen issues with this base where periodically I will get a solvent pop, which is just a tiny little bubble that forms down underneath this base, and later on when you go start spraying the candy, it pops and you end up with a little black hole going down to your primer. And again, there's no fixing it on a candy paint job. You've got to strip and respray parts. And I did have to strip and respray the engine bay cover on the left hand side of the car for that very reason. So I ended up respraying it again. And when I did respray it, I shot it way too heavy, crazed the paint underneath it. I got it before it got to the plastic, but I stripped it again and sprayed it for a 3rd time. I had a lot of trouble with this paint job. But we do eventually make it through and move on to our color. And this is the color we're going for. We're going to shoot 4 coats of Splash Paint's Candy Orange. This is an absolutely gorgeous paint. I love Splash's candies. We do need to spray these in light coats, about 15 to 20 psi again. I think they say you can go up to 25 as well. But I have seen issues where if I spray it too heavy, it can craze as well, but it's not nearly as temperamental as Zero Paints is. This is a much more forgiving paint. Just spray it nice and even and try to keep from making straight lines. You're going to see I do make some passes, but I also kind of swirl around from time to time. I'm trying to keep from making these straight lines, as that's going to create a tiger stripe effect. That's what we call it, is tiger striping. And you're going to end up with lines that are darker than other parts, and it's very hard to even that back out once it starts. So we're going to spray one direction, kind of back and forth, and then we're going to cut across the part side to side just to make sure that we're not getting into that line pattern. Also, this car is all swooping curves. There is no straight lines really on the car, so it's important that we get a nice, smooth, even coat so that it flows along those curves nicely. Another thing that you will notice is after I spray each additional part, I'm going to compare that part with the first part that I sprayed to try and make sure that I'm keeping the color even across all the parts as well. This is very important, especially with all these parts. This is what makes this a very challenging paint job, but in the end, I think the results are very rewarding as well. Alright, so it is on to the second coat, and this footage is going to be sped up to about double speed. We got about 4 coats to go through. The important parts have been covered. Keep your paint nice and smooth, keep everything even, rotate, change your angles so that you don't do your stripes, and of course compare those parts against each other after you get that first part sprayed. Alright, on to coat number 3, and you can really start to see that color is building up now. All right, and now we're on to coat number 4. Now we're pretty close to fully covered at this point. This last coat just pushes us that last little bit and really helps to even out the coverage, make sure that everything is nice and smooth. This color, once we get clear on it, is just going to explode. Okay, so the lower door has 2 mount points. Now the upper door panel has a small recess, and then it also has a small locating pin, and these are going to mate up with the bottom door panel. Now we don't want to get any clear coat on these mating surfaces on the lower door panel, or it might affect the way these 2 parts sit together when we mate them up. So what we're going to do, we're just going to take some Tamiya tape here and we're going to mask these off. Now if you are going to do something dumb like cut masking tape while it's on a part, be very careful that you don't cut the part. Now for the mount points at the front of the lower door, this is going to be a little more tricky as I want to get not only the mount point but also the leading edge where it meets up, because this very edge at the very top presses up against the upper door panel and I don't want to get clear on that either. So I'm going to put some tape on here. I'm going to mark off where that line is. We'll then remove that tape and cut the masking clean. The last thing you want to do is try and cut this while it's on the part. There's a really good chance you're going to end up cutting the part. And then we can carefully reposition the tape to make sure that we don't cover parts that we actually do want to get clear coat on. Alright, we are back in the booth and we're going to be spraying some of this Spray Gunner No Name 2K Clear. Chris swears by the stuff. It's actually really quite good. However, when they sent me mine, my thinner had evaporated out of the bottle because they over-tightened the cap and stripped the cap. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to mix it 2 parts clear to 1 part hardener per their instructions, and I'm going to add a slight amount of Mr. Leveling thinner instead of their thinner. Now, I have reached out to Spray Gunner. They said it was perfectly fine using Mr. Leveling thinner. I have used this before like this and it laid down super smooth. It works really well with it, so we're going to do it here again. Now you don't want to use too much thinner, chances are you're going to get runs. So you want to do roughly around 10%. So for 6 parts of clear and 3 parts of hardener, you're going to use a little bit less than a milliliter. I went ahead and did a milliliter. I like to be a little thinner. I'm going to use a pipette and I'm pumping it through this little filter, this thing that I just dropped on top of the airbrush. It's a 190 micron paint strainer that fits in your spray cup. You're supposed to leave it in there, but it blocks my cap from going on, and I want to make sure I don't slosh any of the clear around. So I'm just going to take it off, put my cap on, and start spraying. Straining the clear like this just helps to make sure you don't get any, globs or debris. Maybe there's a little chunk on the edge of the bottle that fell into the clear while you were mixing it. You don't want any of that in your clear. So it's a really good idea to have some form of a paint strainer, like a little 190, whether it's the big funnel size or it's one of these little caps. Just strain your clear before you put it in the brush, and that'll really help you out. So the instructions for this clear say to spray 2 to 3 wet coats. Now we've always heard spray like a really light tack coat first and let that get sticky for about 10 minutes. Spray Gunner does not recommend this. They just recommend 2 to 3 wet coats. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put down one medium-ish wet coat. It's gonna look fairly smooth. It may not be absolutely perfect, but I'm gonna get that on the subsequent coats. I don't want it so heavy that it's going to run or that it's gonna sag along the bottom edge. However, we don't want it to look really grainy either. Once we get this first coat down, we're going to give it about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we're going to lay down one more nice wet coat, and when we're done with this second coat, it's going to be perfectly smooth. Look all your parts over. If you see any that still look a little rough, give them an extra shot. Just make sure everything's smooth, because the way it looks now is pretty much the way it's going to look when it's dry. Alright guys, here we are. This is our finished result. It's just kind of taped up against the chassis for right now, but that gives you an idea of what we are looking at color wise. As far as I'm concerned, the color matches really well against all the parts. The camera kind of makes it look, some of the parts look a little funny. That's just because of the way the light is hitting the candy and the angle of the parts. Looking at them in person, I can't see any difference in them. They look really good to me. We do have all but I think one part sanded and polished. There's just a little bit of dirt in it. I forget, it's one of these, and I don't remember which one of these lower door panels it is, but one of them has a dust nib in it. Everything else is polished up and is looking great. It polished out fantastic. I don't want to go crazy with it just because I only went with 2 coats of clear. I did not shoot a 3rd coat. So I didn't want a whole lot of really bad like syrup lines on the edges, so I stuck with only 2 coats, and it turned out really well. And it's kind of hard to see given the angle and whatnot, but all the parts have come out nice and clear. The polish is fantastic, and I just love the way the light hits this candy paint. And that extra fine base is just fantastic. It's not overly grainy like some of your candy bases can be. This is the part where we had some damage on it. And as you can see, we've got that pretty well sanded and polished out. It was right across here. So, day has been saved. Now, as far as the rest of the videos go, I've gone through the first 25 steps in the instruction manual. There's 47 steps in total. I've gathered all the parts and put them into bags for chunks of steps that will align out to videos. Apparently I've gotten all the way through step 33. So getting to step 33, I have 5 bags, which means 5 videos just getting through the first 33 steps. This is going to be a long series, guys. So we're going to try to get this thing done before the end of the year. I don't know if we're going to make it or not. We will see. As for this video, that's going to be a wrap. Thanks for hanging out and building with me. I always appreciate y'all watching the videos, and I will catch you guys on the next one.